Welcome to The Breakdown with Dr. Earl, a mental health podcast. This is Dr. Earl Turner, a licensed psychologist and psychology professor in Los Angeles. Just a few disclaimers. The Breakdown podcast is not intended to replace working with a licensed mental health professional. From just going through 2020, a lot of people have experienced a lot of traumatic events in their lives, from not just dealing with death related to COVID-19, but also thinking about issues around racism and what sort of traumatic experiences that has had for people too. But just to sort of get your thoughts and help the audience really understand, when we talk about like grief, how do you define that? Like what is grief?
Sure. So yeah, when we talk about 2020, we can't not have the conversation about grief and loss, because that's what this year has been. It has been a loss of life as we once knew it, and grief is really just the process of working through any type of loss. It doesn't necessarily have to be a death. So I want to make that very clear for your audience too, because some people think, well, I can't be grieving if I didn't necessarily lose someone, whether it's to COVID or anything else, right? But it's a loss of life as we once knew it, and that can be with a person, a loved one, no longer here physically with us, but it also could be, as we talked about, with COVID, we lost our way of life in March, and up to now. And what we once thought life was going to be, it no longer is. And so you have a lot of people fighting against it, and it's very interesting from a sociological and psychological standpoint to see people fighting against change, right? People fighting against wanting to wear a mask, people just defying different orders because they don't feel comfortable in the loss that has occurred. And so there's a sense of denial there, I think, for a lot of people, and that is one of the stages of grieving. But again, it can be also a loss of identity. There are some people who have lost jobs during this time period, and some people define themselves by their jobs and their careers. And so now they have to rediscover parts of themselves that they didn't even know were there, or that they didn't think that they would ever have to do, or at least in the near future. So we've got to look at loss from a wider lens than just as a process, and grieving, I should say, as just a process of losing somebody physically that we love.
Yeah, you touched on a really um, important point, at least for me, that I had not thought about. So in terms of, and I'm going off on a tangent just a little bit, but I
Sure.
think that the idea about the denial piece and people not wanting to wear masks, and so I hadn't thought about it that way in terms of like grieving the loss of change, which is a really, I think, important point that maybe people listening can really understand why some people have a real hard time, wearing a mask over both their mouth and their nose.
Right.
So I do think that it's interesting to really understand, like, thinking about those stages of grief, that denial piece is really important, because you can't fully heal from grief until you're able to really confront and accept the fact that things are actually different, which I think people have been struggling with all through 2020.
Yes. Yes. And yeah, we can't, unless we feel, we can't heal. And just acknowledging and having the awareness that this exists and things are different, that's where the healing takes place, is that true acknowledgement. I think, that's what we see. And my guess is you probably see this in the therapy room, that even for people who come in and they know that they need or want help, and they want to change, it's still challenging for them. And you're talking about people who are on that scale of readiness, closer to, definitely ready, versus just the pre-contemplation or something along those lines. So it is a challenge.
And I have your book, From Morning to Night, Overcoming Loss. And I wanted to sort of touch on that just a little bit, and we'll definitely let people know where they can find that. But you talked about your sister in the book, and a couple of other sort of life experiences that I think are really helpful for people to not just sort of understand how you navigated, overcoming that loss, but how they may be able to do that, for themselves. And so, talk with me for a little bit about like what like led you to decide to write this book about overcoming loss.
Oh, yeah. Well, thank you for um, the the talk of my book. Man,
Sorry,
so it actually
I didn't prepare you for that question.
no. I love it though. I mean, it's because honestly, I started writing the day after my dad died. Um, so my dad passed in February of 2012, and he would always tell me, son, you need to write about your experiences. Now, he was talking about my experiences in the therapy room. He was like, just based on like the stories I would tell my parents of some of the clients, obviously keeping everything confidential, but just the experiences. But he would always say, son, you need to document your experiences. And I happened to make it home. I was living in DC. He was in Massachusetts. My mom called me that day in DC. And she's a nurse, but she had retired to take care of him. He had suffered from Alzheimer's related complications for years, and which I think was partially triggered by my sister's death. But anyway, she called and said, you need to come home. And I knew as a nurse, if my mom said that, I got on a plane that night, and I was able to sit with my dad at his bedside that night. And there was an experience where, despite being comatose for several, days at that point, he opened his eyes. We communicated with each other, and I told my mom, and she was like, "What? That's crazy, because I've been sitting here with him this entire time, nothing." And so I knew that I needed to write that down. And from there, it just morphed into, it was actually more so going to just be a journal entry and an opportunity for me to just put my thoughts and feelings on paper. And then as I started writing more and more about these different losses, I realized that's what it was morphing into, was about that book. And then I started telling people I'm writing a book, and I was kind of lying. I was kind of like seeing what their response was going to be. But when everybody was saying, do it, like, you should definitely do it, I know somebody who could benefit from that message, etc. At that point, I knew I had to take further action.
Yeah. Or you can get an appointment. And so, like, how can
Mm-hmm.
people cope or manage their symptoms of grief, like in the interim before they can maybe find a therapist, or even find a
Mm-hmm.
therapist that maybe is a good fit for them?
And yeah, that's a great point, because if the first therapist you find isn't a good fit, there are a lot of us out there. Like, keep looking. Yeah, it's like trying on a pair of jeans or a new shirt. Like, sometimes it may not be a good fit initially, but you keep looking until you find that right fit. So, yes. A. B. So I actually just had the honor of recording a 5-day depression series, depression support series on the Tapping Solution app. And it was developed with the Nick Ortner, Jessica Ortner, and using kind of my experiences for myself, the clinical experiences of working with people who have gone through depression. We kind of poured all of that into this 5-day series, and we've received already tremendous feedback about the beneficial impact of this series. So, if somebody in the interim needs something, wants something right here and now, that is certainly something that they can go to. It's on that Tapping Solution app. But also then I would say, and it's on my website as well, but I would also say meditation and mindfulness and or yoga. Those are things that you can do specific for yoga, specific for grief and depression. You can, on the Insight Timer app, and I don't make any money from these apps, by the way. But on the Insight Timer app, I mean, it is a phenomenal app, and I've heard great things about Calm and Headspace and things like that too. But my go-to is Insight Timer, and you could just type in grief or loss or depression, and you'll find multiple, many meditations that can just walk you through the process of being with those emotions. Um, because too often we try to avoid them, and part of our healing is about being with our emotions. Aren't there to hurt us. They're just there to alert us. And so things like meditation, tapping, they allow you to give that voice. And in the right now, if you can't get in to see a therapist, it gives you that immediate tool.